Right. So, welcome to this short workshop on continuous integration using GitHub Actions. So, as Dominic's mentioned, this is going to be kind of leading on from some of the talking we've done on using Git and GitHub, and it's going to be especially related to the kind of automation that you can that ends up being very useful when collaborating on code shared between multiple people, especially when it's open source. So, half-minute introduction on me. I'm an RSE with ICCS. I've overused GitHub Actions in a bunch of the work I've done, and also in a number of hobby projects. So let's get started. For a quick intro on the word continuous integration, I tend not to like using the word because it's a pure buzzword at this point, and it gets kind of stuck on in places that doesn't, often with little explanation. So let me talk about what came before continuous integration. In software engineering, there are certain well-defined project methodologies, kind of like scheduling approaches for the entire project. A really well-known one from the olden days, which is less popular nowadays, is the waterfall model, where you divide your whole software project into a number of stages, and you kind of never revisit a previous stage. So you do all of the design work up front, and then you spend all the time doing your implementation and checking. And if you have to go back to a previous stage, then the theory is that you lose lots of the work that you did before because you kind of can't go up the waterfall, you have to redo all the work. It is useful for things that are highly specified, but in recent times, it's ended up that a more flexible approach has been really useful. And this is where the agile development methodology became really popular, because instead of having this idea where everything is done up front in the waterfall model, it's highly iterative instead. You kind of take things piecemeal. You'll say, maybe you'll have a short, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 6 months of sort of allotted time where you say, well, let's work on this feature and we'll flesh it out, we'll design it, we'll implement it, we'll test it, such, and then we'll move on to the next feature, and we'll design that from scratch and implement that. So, where does continuous integration, CI, fit in? CI, to me, is practices that enable agile development. And largely, when people talk about CI, they're mostly talking about the automation side of it. So having stuff that kind of automatically happens whenever you do something interesting to your project. So it's the automation it's the automation side of CI that makes it convenient. Because the point of a methodology is for you to be able to develop useful software quickly. And agile development makes things a lot more iterative and flexible. Continuous integration lets you do automation, which makes things much more convenient. So, that'll do. Today's workshop is going to be split into 2 or 3 parts. I don't have another slide, but here we go. I'm going to talk at you a tiny bit for the first half of this, about a bit more about CI, and then how GitHub Actions takes that model and how you use that. I'll go over a tiny bit of the syntax, how you configure using GitHub Actions, and then we'll do a good amount of demoing, walking through the GitHub Actions UI, looking at how workflows run, and so on and so on. Then we're going to have, I've got a, not printed, but a worksheet, which if you have a laptop and a GitHub account, then you can fork my repository and work on adding and changing around workflows on some projects. Then we'll have a discussion on the exercises. It depends on how much time we have at the end, because I had to think about the exercises. They may take a while. They may take a bit longer than we expect. So the last part will just be discussing the exercises, maybe going through what people have found on the documentation, and then a bit more discussion on some other usages of CI, different platforms like GitLab, and a couple of tips and tricks and other stuff. Right. So, that previous slide, the first slide, I discussed CI about, I mentioned collaboration, and that's the most interesting thing for me about CI, is why it's useful when you're working with others in a project. It could be, you might be working in remote with a bunch of people, you might be working in person with them, or a mix of both. Regardless, it ends up being really useful to kind of encode things in automation. So if code ownership is shared for your project, it can be really, really useful to, or rather it's quite important, I think, to assert qualities about that work before it gets merged into your main project, which you would then treat as perhaps verified, and you're like, okay, this is fine, we don't need to re-review this. But then the question is how you verify those changes. You might have a test suite which you run. You might have a couple of guidelines about code coverage, like Chris was mentioning in the workshop on testing the other day. And maybe you're even a bit fussy about how exactly your commits get made for your Git repository. So you've got all these checks, and someone has to run these. And these have to be written somewhere so that people know about them and know to do them. It's a bit tedious, and a large amount of CI, when you hear about it, is all about automating this stuff away so that you can kind of encode these checks in some configuration file that can get run automatically for you, and there's no more having to think about them. It can be really, really useful if you have a project that ends up being sort of quite sprawling in how much it's trying to. For example, if you've got a library that's trying to support lots and lots of platforms, it can be rather hellish to have to run all of the test suites on every different platform and stuff. Automation is a godsend in these sorts of examples. So a common model for everything CI, for lots of different services that provide this automation on running things based on running things on code repositories. They usually have this model of you run jobs over your repository based on triggers. So a job could be anything from running a test suite. It could be what we mentioned before, asserting a certain amount of code coverage and then failing if it's below that. Actually, a very common one with code coverage I've seen is asserting that all functions have like a doc string or some sort of formal documentation connected to them. You can run a reformatter, make sure everyone's using the same code style, and so on and so on. I'm only showing nice simple ones, but you can also go quite overboard. And similarly with triggers, you can have really nice. The most common trigger would be something like you make a change to your repository and it runs one of these jobs, for example, all of your tests. But you can go a bit further if you want. If you have a more complex piece of code, you can connect workflows together by saying, I want to run workflow X if workflow Y passes. And you can run them on schedules. That ends up being quite common, perhaps because it matches very nicely to the kind of more simple, the more simple case of imagining if this was on a physical PC. And you can also just run your jobs manually if you'd like. So there's ways to do that with GitHub Actions. So GitHub Actions sticks to this model of running jobs on triggers. It uses the exact same terminology as well, which is very convenient. The documentation for all of this is fantastic, and I'll be peppering. I've peppered links through the exercises, and I'm hoping that will be handy. Rather than me copying all of GitHub's work, it is their platform. They've done a good job. So GitHub Actions uses the concept of workflow. That's their word that they will throw at you through all of the documentation. And a workflow file is stored in a specific, I should use the pointy stick here. Workflow file is stored in a specific folder in your repository. As a regular file, you can have as many workflow files as you want, but essentially GitHub kind of picks up that, oh, you've got a file that ends in .yaml in GitHub workflow, and it's like, oh, okay, I'll read this as a workflow file. I'll go back. I didn't mention, but I said YAML there, which is it's a data representation. It's a data representation format that's human and machine readable. It's nice and convenient. Many of you have seen it before, but we've got a couple of resources to point you exactly sort of how you need to use it and debugging some funky issues that can happen. So, on the left is a snippet of a workflow file in this YAML syntax. Here we're defining a single job in a workflow. You can have any number of jobs in a single workflow file. Have any number of workflow files. The main things of interest in a job is you define the work that you want to do, which is just a list of commands that you would run in your shell. And you define the platform that it runs on, which is like Linux, Mac, Windows. You can also, with other configurations, you can just ask to use the Docker image, and you can do a bunch of configuration in the middle here, which is like, set my default shell to X or Y. Quite common in working with Windows on this stuff. So that was jobs. Triggers are defined in the same file on the same kind of level. So indentation matters in YAML, and so do new lines. So you you'll see as we see some of the demos if that's unusual. But of course, it's the same as Python. Actually, it feels weirdly inspired by Python thinking about it. Triggers for a single workflow file you can have, again, any number of, and they're defined by, we write the trigger type and then any config that it has for it. And pretty much all of this trigger stuff, you just check the documentation as you work through. You figure out, what do I need? When do I want this workflow file to run? Google GitHub Actions triggers, and work from there. Oh, an important part about all this, GitHub Actions, I confirmed actually this morning, GitHub Actions is free and I think unlimited use for public repositories. For private repositories, it's also free, but you have something like 2,000 minutes per month, which is a lot, mind you. That's, I think, more than an hour.
That's very few.
That's few?
Yes, because you have a multitude of platforms you're going to test over.
Yes.
And if you're going to have anything complicated and your test tube is installing, you're burning through those minutes like nothing. So if you have a private repository, use a private runner. You can just throw a machine as a resource to GitHub.
That's a very good point. If you have a more complex setup, well, something that's more than running a small test suite on a single operating system, then yes, you are liable to burn through your free credits. But what you can do is, when I've talked about, I missed out something while talking about platforms and jobs here. You can actually specify. Actually, this might be slightly outside the jobs and triggers model, but But you can specify to GitHub, instead of using one of GitHub's free machines, you can rent your own machine, like from DigitalOcean or AWS, wherever you like, and you can host your own job runner. If that ends up being cheaper, then that sorts your problems. If you're using, this is only for if you're using private repositories. If you're able to have your stuff open source, you don't have to worry about that so much. But we can have a bit more discussion on that actually at the end if that's useful. So, how are we doing for time? Good. Next we're going to have, I'm going to demo the GitHub Actions interface, and we'll go through a couple of projects and the workflow files in them and just get used to the UI a tiny bit to see how things run. Right. Let me find my good. How's that look?
Here, pretty good.
So let's. Right, where to begin? This is an example repository I've got on GitHub. We'll use this for the exercises as well, but I'll just point out, yeah, workflow files are just files in your repository. They show up just regularly in GitHub, and you store them alongside your code as normal. So we can have a look at some of the workflow files with my mouse already present. And I'll point out, let's show my pipe. I'm actually going to see if I can put two side by side. Hope that looks good. Yeah, that's fine. So we'll use this one. So GitHub Actions is wonderful because it's as simple and obvious as it comes. There's very little that we have to ask for GitHub to do a decent amount for us. There's some metadata that I haven't talked about. Some other keys in the YAML file that you can use. You name stuff. It shows up nicer in the actions. I'll show that in just a sec. I'll point out the on bits, which are the triggers. This has hardly any triggers. It just has a special one that lets us run this manually by clicking a button. And it has a single job, which runs on Ubuntu latest. And then the steps are, this is an ordered list where we use some special actions here, and then we just do some regular shell commands at the bottom. So this workflow, just as it says near the bottom, it installs MyPy and it runs MyPy on a single file. And something I didn't mention is that the output of a workflow is green, yes, or red, no. And that is picked up from the return code of commands. So if any of your commands fail in the steps list, if any of these fail, if any of them have a return code of non-zero, then the workflow will end up, it'll stop immediately, and it will give you a bunch of information on the online interface. So I'm going to have a look to see if we already have, I think I'll just full screen this one. So there are a couple of different workflow files on this repository. Let's have a look at the one I was looking at was the type checking for binary search. That's the name I gave it, so here we go. I haven't run this one. I think it's because I updated it. So here we go. Since I've got this workflow dispatch thing, I can run this I can run this manually, sorry, and that's how we're gonna see this run. I found that this is really nice for debugging. I've only just learned about it recently. A common thing with GitHub Actions is if you want to debug your workflows then you end up having to spam test commits so that your triggers fire. It can be very handy instead to you can just add a single line to say workflow_dispatch just says give me a button on the interface that lets me run it. So okay, it's already finished on this side. So this is what GitHub, this is the actions interface to a single workflow run. Let's click on, this is one of the jobs. There's only one job in this file. And it shows for each different step in the job, it gives you a tab of like all of the console output that happened there. There's a couple of extra jobs as well. There's like post run, one of the commands in the thing, and that happens for special commands that they insert their own deinitialization stuff at the end. It's rather nice. So if I'm somewhat curious if setup Python shows us anything. Nah, nothing at all.
So what does the checkout, what's the deal with having to say that it uses checkout? Is that needed because it's getting the code, if we want it to get the latest code, we need to always use that?
Yes, the actions checkout step, it's kind of special sauce for GitHub Actions. You almost always pop it at the start of your job. It states, or it asks GitHub, please check out the repository that I'm configured for. I suppose it's giving, you're made to do it explicitly because it gives you the potential to configure this step to do weird things, like you can clone your Git repository in a slightly, you can clone your Git repository to get more. This, by default, this clones the Git repo really quickly. It does a shadow copy, I think, because that's useful if you have a huge repository with tons of history. You can configure this, and you can potentially move it later and so on and do other stuff, which is perhaps a reason that it's explicit. You just have to put that in all of your jobs. Yeah.
One of the most powerful things you can do is check out somebody else's code.
Really?
And
you can check someone else's code?
Yes, you can use a different repository, and so you can do reverse checking whether or not their newest version still works with your code.
I didn't know about that. So, one of the audience members, I understand that I should repeat. Should I repeat what people say?
Yeah.
No worries. You can actually do some more interesting stuff with checkout. You can also check out other people's repositories, which lets you, I suppose, probably it's slightly harder to, you can't test individual commits that way. You would have to, only use the head branch or whatever. But that also seems, that's quite interesting. I've treated that primarily as just magic syntax because I always have it at the start of my my workflows.
In principle, you can check what it does. The source code never runs in the lake.
Oh, of course. Yeah, we can actually just have a look.
No, I mean what it does in the source code for the actions in the lake or
we can. You are right. We can actually the actions checkout thing here. It actually just means the checkout repository under the actions user. So actions checkout. The problem is, I think it might be written in Node, because that's how actions are defined. I think source. I don't think we'll spend very long on this because I'm pretty sure it's. Oh, it's TypeScript. I saw it. Hold on, I've lost. I can't see my mouse. I'm gonna have to change.
Good to know where it is, though.
There we go. Yeah, well, you can take a look at exactly how it works if you like. Did you? I can't help anymore. I can't help it.
Well, it's good to know that what that means and where it links to at least. That's, gives something useful because there's probably documentation here as well.
And indeed, I'll bring it up later when we go through a couple more and see a bit more of this used. But yeah, I should make sure it's clear now. There are actually a couple of different types of steps that you can use. This is slightly different actually to GitLab's syntax, if any of you have seen that. I'll show that kind of later. When you see this command here, it starts with a dash because it's an element of the steps list, YAML syntax. And you start this line with run, which is saying this is a shell command step where I want to run a single shell command in whatever the default shell is for the runner I'm on. Separate to run is instead you can say you can write users at the start, which instead of running a single shell command, it goes and it does what we just quickly did, where it looks at the action/checkout repository and uses it as a GitHub Actions, gosh, I've forgotten the name, but a GitHub Actions step. And you can actually write these yourself. If you can do interesting things like sort of factor out a common pattern into a workflow file that can be reused, like a parameterized workflow file, and you use it in a similar way to action/checkout. And this action/setup Python one, it sets up Python for us. It ensures that Python is set up to be run on the host machine. So we've had a look at this first, this nice simple workflow on that just does some MyPy type checking of a file. We didn't look too much at the logs over here because it ran so fast, and we don't have too much information from MyPy other than. Oh, I should make this tiny bigger, shouldn't I? Oh, it makes both larger. Hope that's okay. The only logs, I'll tab this down because this is just giving us information about the machine it's running on. The only information we got from MyPy is success, no issues found. This is exactly the same. I'll switch to my terminal here. Switch to my terminal, and I'll actually go into the same repository, and we'll look at the binary search. We'll look at the binary search typed file because this actually has types for that MyPy can look at, and we should probably get the same output. There you go, because that's what GitHub Actions is doing. It's just running MyPy. It's just running this command in its own shell. So let's look at something a bit more. Let's look at something a bit more interesting. Let's look, and this will be a bit related to the exercise, but let's look at a more complex work file in one of my own projects. Ooh.
So do you recommend that people write YAML files themselves, or is there sort of template system?
So Dominic's pointed out, should you write YAML files by yourself, or I'll actually go back to my. Oh, thank you very much for that, Dominic. I have a template file that I prepared over here. There's often a lot of overlap between simple GitHub Actions workflows. There's often a lot of overlap, and it can be a bit of a pain to. It can occasionally be a bit of a pain with YAML to remember and to get correct the indentation that you need, and to remember some of the things like checkout and the specific actions, specific use actions that install whatever software you need. So what I tend to do is, where's my back? I'm gonna have to move this quickly. I can't see it. Where's my mouse? There we go. Let me just go back to the workflows thing. Where's my template? Hold for a sec while I find the file that I'm interested in. I should have a template file somewhere here. Ooh, I think I might have taken it out of the repository because it hinted at the answers to the exercise a bit too much. Yeah, okay, that's fine. What I tend to do when I'm working with GitHub Actions is I have a template file for projects that I often use GitHub Actions on, and I copy it between because you always tend to write the same sort of things. Well, I should show some more interesting triggers. I'll do that in a sec. This actually is almost the exact same as the one I just showed you. It's just missing a couple of things. Like it doesn't actually do anything with the Python bits installed yet. Let me show. Yeah.
What do the ampersand v3 and ampersand v4?
At the end of this one here.
After checkout and setup checkout.
Thank you, good point. This is more GitHub Actions special syntax. It actually, the actual use, the thing it does behind the scenes is it asks when the runner goes to the actions/checkout GitHub repository, it actually specifically looks for the commit that's tagged v3. And it's a nice, convenient. GitHub realized they already have a version control system right in front of them, so it's the way that you version control your own steps if you wanted to write your own, and it's also the way that GitHub have version controlled theirs. If you leave this off, then it uses the latest commit. But with this CI stuff, there was a tendency to be rather explicit in the versions that you have, the versions of code, I suppose, that run, which means this won't break. Since we've tagged the version of checkout, nothing strange will happen if we ran this in 5 years, as opposed to if perhaps they updated a couple of these steps and now they behave slightly differently. And then you have a surprising difference if you run your repository 5 years later. That's all that is. We're just setting the version of actions/checkout to use. Yeah, you'll see on the GitHub Actions documentation that they use this syntax throughout. You'll often see that exact line, actions/checkout at v3. So I've talked quite a lot about the jobs side of GitHub Actions and how you set the platform that you're on, you do a bit of setup at the start, and then it's pretty much like you can actually, I think of it as a makefile if anyone here is more used to those. Well, the part of a makefile inside a target, because there's no dependency munging here. Because at the end of it, you're just asking to run a bunch of shell commands after each other. So there's
also a way that GitHub could give you through the interface, right? There's lots of examples through Actions, isn't there?
That's right. If you actually have if anyone has an example repository on if anyone has a repository on GitHub which doesn't have GitHub Actions set up, so if you don't have any workflows in it, I can give you a nice example if I just scroll down and find an old one of mine.
I think you could do it on this one, couldn't you? Couldn't you just do it on this example?
Could I just use that example to find one of the default GitHub templates?
Yeah.
Let's have a look. So Actions. Oh, this is a different.
You run
go back to the previous. Yeah. Actions. New workflow. Yes, it does. Yeah, thank you very much, Dominic. GitHub also gave you quite a few for popular languages. Python is really good for this. Haskell slightly less so, but lots of compiled and interpreted languages, the popular ones, will have quite a few templates for you to choose from. So if we have a quick look at Python application by GitHub Actions, this should probably be quite generic for applying some check to a Python application. So it's going to run on Linux, and hopefully it'll do just some of the same checkout that we did at the start. I'll ignore the stuff at the top because that was setting up triggers. But this default template that they're giving us runs on Ubuntu. At the top, it does the same checkout stuff that we do. It sets up Python 3.10. I do the same. I may well have No, actually, I took mine from a different one. It just ended up being the same. Installs dependencies, assuming that it assumes your repository is set up with a requirements.txt file, and it automatically it figures that might be a useful line for you. Oh, and then it automatically it adds in a bit of stuff that we did as well. It gives you a kind of base example of doing some linting with a certain Python linter I haven't heard too much about, and then running your PyTest. And if either of these get run in order, if Flake8 fails, then you'll have something on GitHub Actions will say, oh, that didn't work, I won't run PyTest, I'll error out now. I can probably show an example of one of these failing. Right, we'll leave the tricks for now. Yeah, let me show you an example of failing, because I have a slightly different workflow here. Let's have a quick look. Oh, you can click on the file name up here and it'll open it, right? I have an ever so slightly different workflow file here. It's almost the same. We're still using Python. We've got no triggers apart from the manual one. But instead it's installing Black, which is a Python reformatter, and it runs check on a given one of the files in my repo. It doesn't make any changes because unless you do a decent amount more work, GitHub Actions won't save any changes to your repository. You can set it up you can set up quite a lot of automation if you would like to sort of enforce something like a style guide so that all files that get checked in are sort of sent through this reformatter and it's not an option. But I think the first step to that, if you were interested in doing something like that, is to simply run a check, and if that check fails, then your committer, the author of this work, knows to go back to their computer and run, Black, this file, and then recommit. So if I run this, one that we're looking at. Oh, come on, I'll just go in here. I can't see the back on my browser. We'll go formatting, and I'll go run workflow. We should see this one fail. It won't be massively interesting, but it won't take very long. Come on. So this is what you see if you're bored. No, it's already shut up. If you're bored and you end up watching workflows run in real time, then this is what you see. Oh, that's awesome. Cool. So we had the setup all worked. It can install Python, but we ended up having, oh no, it would have reformatted a file in our repo. And this would happen if you had your repository set up to run this when somebody was somebody has a pull request that adds a file and it hasn't yet been reformatted, then perhaps you've set up your triggers to run this check every time someone makes a change to a pull request. And if you see this turn red, then you can say, oh, you can ask them, could you please run your file through the reformatter, and then we can, and then the rest of the tests will run, and so on. Right, so the last thing that we'll do, which I haven't shown too much of yet, are triggers in these workflow files. Let me have a quick look at my slides and see if I have anything interesting. No, I'm just here. Yes, I'll show you a snippet that I often use. Let me make this real, and I'll actually head to one of my own repositories. And take a look at the bit I used at the start, because I use this all the time. Actually, I'll fix it real time because I learned about something. There you go. No, it's not closed. It's reopened. I learned about this. That should hopefully fix an edge case, so it'll run a bit better. Again, we're in a different workflow file. They're completely different. This is a Haskell project, and it's got a much more painful job selection. But the triggers are nice and simple. There are two ways that this workflow gets triggered. One is on every push to the main branch. You can add multiple branches here. If you wanted to run on every push to the main and the dev branch, you can do that. You can also use globs here, which are basically regexes, or they're relatively similar. You can have a look at the workflow syntax for a bit more. So you can do things like, you could say, run this workflow on every branch. Let me write it down quick. You could say, run this on every branch that starts with dev slash, or perhaps dev hyphen, or perhaps every one that I decide to name with my username, and so on. You can do a lot there. Depending on what you need, take a look at the documentation.
How do you do all branches?
Can you do all branches?
Yeah. You just do star?
For all branches, I think you could probably use star here, or you could also probably just not configure the branches option.
Oh, right, okay.
If you want to not, if you want to have a trigger that doesn't have any config, you can actually just leave it empty like that and then move to the. Oh no, you can move it. You can leave it empty like so and move on to the next trigger or whatever. I do prefer though to make it a bit clearer. You can do. Here we go. You can write 2 empty braces. It's just the JSON empty object. It's a bit more clear. It's more clear that there's nothing here. It's not that you've just forgotten to write something. It's that it's actually the empty object. So there's no conflict here.
This page left intentionally blank.
I was actually surprised to learn that you didn't have to write that down, because in my head that was potentially ambiguous syntax. And indeed, it's potentially ambiguous. It depends on what follows it. So that's a lot more foolproof to chuck 2 empty curly braces after it. The other trigger on this repository, on this workflow, is my pointy stick. Is to run for every pull request, run on these sets of events. The main one that's interesting is synchronize. So with pull request types synchronize, that's saying run this workflow every time any pull request gets updated. Somebody pushes to it. That's extremely useful and really common for open source projects. Stuff that's open for other people to edit and use. Because it really speeds up the process. Because tests can get automatically run for everything if someone's just making a small change. The opened and reopened ones are just extras that make sure that if you open or close a pull request, they also get run, because that's just convenient. So it's kind of an edge case. So I think that will do for the first half of this. Do we have any questions about any questions about syntax, YAML stuff, or GitHub Actions, or any questions about the stuff that any questions about what you can do, or what you can do with GitHub Actions, or anything we can talk about now, or I can shift to the end of this talk that anyone's interested to hear about. Yes.
You do things like set up email results and tests and things. I mean, the pull request you can just email the person automatically and pay it. Can you do things like that, or like a review, or?
Yes. If this was a Linux system, it would be nice if you could just use something like SendMail.
Mm.
But I wonder if GitHub might have something for this. Hold on, let me go on this one.
A lot of what we do is just sit around with emails on, building test clusters. Come back with our integration testing rather than just watching it or coming back and checking.
Yeah.
You just get an email.
It would. Oh, you've got of course. Yes, by default. I think this is by default on your GitHub account, unless you've changed it. If a workflow fails for a job that was triggered by your user. So if you made the push to a pull request, then like you're involved with it. This might also happen for if you're the reviewer of a pull request. We'll talk a bit more about that, I think tomorrow in one of the talks. So if you're connected with with the reason that a job, a workflow triggered, then you receive an email if it fails. That's actually a GitHub. That's a user config thing, and you can turn them off. I don't know how.
I wish I knew how.
I do get spam.
How have I got this on then, emails? I've not used actions, I must admit.
What was that?
How verbose are the emails? They tell you what the failure points were, they tell you...
I can show you an example, and I'll show you a more interesting example than the simple Python ones we're dealing with here. Because when I work on my own stuff, this might be interesting. Yes, great. Make that slightly larger. Okay. This is one of my projects that I've ended up using. If we have time, I'll talk about this one because it has quite a funny setup that automates building artifacts on Windows, because without that it would be quite a bit more pain. And it failed while I was working on one of the pull requests, and it tells you what fails. This workflow has 4 jobs in it, because I test on Ubuntu twice and then Mac and Windows. And if I click on this, it should show me the logs. Logs actually. Oh, I'm quite surprised. Logs do expire over time, so you shouldn't keep them as you shouldn't imagine that they're historic artifacts. But in this case, this one's still here. So we take a look at this one. Come on. Oh, then it failed with. I did the dependencies wrong. Don't use Haskell ever, because that's all you see. Thank you very much for the question. So yeah, you actually do get by default notifications for something, for a workflow that fails.
Can you say this? Is there an easy way of saying it? Create a failure database?
What was that?
Is it possible to create a failure database and get traceability and things like that? Could you download these logs?
So could you download these logs? Could you download them automatically?
Ideally, yeah. So would it be useful to work out when failures occur?
Yes.
Come back.
I wonder if
6
you're
months down the line. Sporadic failures, things like that.
sporadic failures.
You catch things more in that sort of sense. You can get a passing failure rate. So that kind of recording of that could be useful.
Yeah. I'm not sure. I've not. GitHub have a few exporting
There is a history which is kept for around 20 days or something like that. So you can go to the you can go into this history of all the level to run within the last 20 days, and then you can pick up one which you're interested in.
But can you extract it and like store it locally on your?
Well, you can extract it, you know, from the screen. Yes, you can save it. There is always an option to save it. I don't always an option to do it by API or not.
I think you can use the API to pull the logs.
You can download them somehow. I don't know if you can automate it easily.
Well, if you can use the API, you can automate it. You set up another GitHub repository which pulls the logs from your failing Git.
Yeah, actually, I'm somewhat a bit baffled that I don't immediately find a job that like Sept that automates downloading the logs for a given day or something for a repo. But yes, if you're interested in that, you may well want to do what I would do, and I started to do there, which is have a Google around for GitHub Actions exporting logs and such. You can definitely download individual ones.
I know we were chatting a bit yesterday. Suppose you want to test your code with proprietary compilers or, say, proprietary libraries. Is there a way to easily do that with the GitHub machines, or is that the point where you want to maybe look at moving it to a droplet or something else?
That's a really good question. Yeah, it depends on your exact situation with the proprietary libraries, because if it's, for example, a situation where you have you have a binary blob, a library that you don't have the source code for, but you have the you have a binary library that you can use, or an executable. Depending on the situation, depending on whether you're allowed to, you can potentially you could make a Docker image, a public Docker image that has that library, and you can just configure a runner. You can configure a runner to use it. Actions Docker run on. Let me. Alright, well then I'm showing this is the wrong thing. But you can more or less. I don't know the exact syntax because I haven't used it before. But you can more or less replace runs on with a Docker image. To my understanding, you can. It might be slightly more in depth than that. So that works for public Docker images. If you wanted, if you weren't able to upload this to a public Docker image, then you could potentially create a Docker image that has this. You know what? We can also simplify it, and we can, if we're doing this privately, we can ignore the fact that we need to use a Docker image, and you could instead, if you're able to upload this library somewhere on the internet with a passworded. Might be going too far itself.
Wouldn't you have to put the password in the thing though? If it was a private repo, it'd be okay.
Well, no, you wouldn't. You don't have to. If you have secrets, for example, let me refer to GitHub Actions documentation here. Cool. If, for example, you need to in one of your workflows, so in order to use some program that you use in testing or anything else that you use to sort of alongside your program, even to run it perhaps, if you want to test that it runs successfully in CI. If you need to access an API, say, and you have your own API key for that, which you need to treat as secret, you do not want to check that in to the repository, because all of these workflow files are just stored in the repository as normal. They're committed the same way, and their history is treated the exact same way. Which means if you add a secret and then remove it in two separate commits, the secret is still there, mind you. So GitHub has something else for this. You can, there's a different tab in each repository, which lets you, so there are settings in your repositories which let you specify secrets. Here they are. Actions. Right. So you can define secrets which get thrown into your environment variables in your CI runs, but they're not stored in your workflow files. And you're only able to see these secrets if you're if you have, for example, if you're an admin or a maintainer of this repository. This does bring up an important point, which is, well, what's stopping someone from writing a workflow that simply prints that secret out to the logs? And indeed, these workflows won't. If you try to fork a repository and run the workflows, it actually tells you, I won't run these workflows unless you had a look at them, because otherwise you may be running someone's workflows that print some secrets that might be configured in your repository. So yes, workflows have sort of access to these secrets, and you have to know what you're running. Yes.
So by default. Yes. So by default, it does not export secrets to forks at all. So if you get a pull request from a fork, it just doesn't export the secret. And then there was a wave of abuse where people were running crypto miners and pull requests. And that's then we did tragedy of the commons. And now we need to say run this PR, the continuous integration.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah. To your question earlier, there is a REST API for exporting the logs. And if you really want to do deep diving into like failure analysis, there are different CI providers, like BuildKite, that whose whole selling point is that you can do these kinds of analysis much more easier than on GitHub Actions.
Great, thank you very much. So, I'd like to move on to some of the exercises that I've got prepared. We've not got printouts, but that works fine for the online folks as well. So let me jump onto. I'm going to send a link. Dominic, is there also a link on the schedule page?
On the resources page of the website, there's a link to your repo.
Great.
It's the GA-CI one.
Okay, great.
So people can follow that through to the exercise. I can put the exercise link there explicitly as well. But yeah.
Yeah, if people are able to, so if you can, if you have a laptop and you're willing to have a go at trying some GitHub Actions stuff, then click on the link on the resources page on the summer school website, or alternatively, oh, it's in tiny text. Oh, but it's here, I guess. Alternatively, you can go to this repository on GitHub, GA-CI, under my name, my username. And on the README, if you just scroll down a tiny bit, then there's two links here. Slides at the top, and then exercises. The slides might be useful to look back on for some of the exercises. So I'll go through. I'll show this for a while for people who don't have it on their computer just yet. I'm going to have to zoom out though. Okay. Yeah, the exercises are going to be fork the repository that we had a look at just previously. There's a couple of different workflow files on there, and you can actually look at all of them. The first bit is going to get you to just mess with some of the one or two of the workflows and get used to some of the syntax and take a look at the UI. So yeah, that's all there, and I'll quickly show the second bit if we have time. We did discuss a bunch of stuff earlier, so we might not get onto so much of this. But there's another repository which doesn't yet have a workflow file, and I want you to write a workflow file that runs the tests for that otherwise unknown project. I'm hoping that half of you won't even be able to run the tests on your local machine, because that way you have to use GitHub Actions for it. So have a look at that. Have a look at this second task if you've gotten through the first one. So there's there's a few links to relevant documentation on GitHub Actions, and also just some other notes and snippets that will end up being useful. This is how I do all of my GitHub Actions work, by the way. The docs are really useful, and it's also still new enough that there aren't always fantastic Stack Exchange answers for things that you might want. So I suppose 20 or so minutes to work through that. I think what we'll do is maybe in around 10 minutes we'll go through the first exercise together and just point out one or two things. I think I meant the other one, not calculator. I meant the pi black and pi my pi.
Shall I edit it?
No, the file names are correct. I wrote it wrong in the document.
And then should I But you can just tell people you're amending it.
Yeah. Slight update. I gave you the wrong file names. Sorry. If you're in that repository, GA-CI, I talked about two workflows that didn't exist. I meant to be talking about PyTest. Is that right?
Black.
Thank you.
You've got black. You've got black and white pie in there.
Yeah. No, PyTest was for calculator. Thanks.
Sorry, my exercise had a mistake and I printed it out as a mistake. Doing it on here is much better. Okay.
How do they, I mean, like,
Oh.
people that are coming in at lunchtime.
Yeah.
I just feel like we made everybody be so careful. And it's like false sense of security is that we have people coming in who are tested.
Well, we can ask Emily to do it. We've just asked them to do it. We've got
different
tests, right?
than in here when everybody's kind of separated to wear
Yeah.
masks, but lunchtime everybody will have their masks off.
Well, we just asked them to do it. And we explain why. Because we've asked everyone else to do it, and we feel like it's...
Well, I mean, especially because they're going so here. Very wearing masks all the time. I feel.
Yeah, it's good. It's a really good point. I'm not sure what time David's arriving. I think he's arriving for lunch, so...
In my vast experience of positive COVID tests, they pop up straight away. You don't have to wait 15 minutes. I mean, I've never had one turn positive.
Yeah, me neither, no.
Yeah, so I don't think we need to like hold them outside of it, but I think that we should get them to do it.
5 minutes. Oh, well, then we can make it actually.
Yeah, we
the
can
remaining
keep it.
10 minutes, yeah. Yeah.
Subtly drag them out of the room.
Yeah, that's a great point, yeah.
Okay, so David, is it just those two? Is there anyone else? I just didn't know if there's anybody else coming over.
Not, well...
Or the SASIC people. Should we like...
Most of them have already registered here and
are aware.
I think there might only be one or two. But I would have mentioned they're doing the same with the using.
Okay, so we'll just ask Emily. And
Yeah.
David, I don't know David till we ask him.
Yeah. I don't really know him either, but I'm happy to ask him. I mean, we've talked over email, so...
Okay.
Did you see we got an email from the Cambridge Wine Merchants?
No.
Yeah, I just forwarded it to you.
Oh, great.
He can do it.
Okay. Oh, super.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really good news. Okay. It's like... to check. So, friends of ours work at Cambridge Writing Merchants. He is the accountant who's going to be my back door if we can get a response to that. He told me that he was exposed to COVID at work last week, but he's testing negative.
Right.
So it was last week. So I guess if you probably
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So we can get the wine to come at 5:30. It doesn't have to be for a long time. It could just be for an hour. It's just an hour. But yeah, good.
Do we want to do it in our room?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. So we'll just let everybody know.
We can have the
that's happening.
posters there. And we can spill out to the outside. And
Yeah. Okay. So would they bring everything? We don't need to do anything for that. Or do we need to
no,
get some?
I think they'll bring the glasses and they can do a little spiel.
Should we try and get like a platter of cheesy crackers or something?
Yeah. Sure.
Okay.
I'm never going to say no to that.
I'll ask Lisa. I think I'm gonna ask to do like platters. So I'll see if I don't know what their turnaround is. Otherwise, we can just we'll just be sending Lisa to
the shop.
M&S or Waitrose.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Awesome.
So how have people gotten on with the first task of working with the two workflows and amending them so they run and then combining them into a single file? Anyone having any major issues with things not running or triggering as you hope?
The workflow is failing.
The workflow is failing. That's probably correct. I think the reformatter should fail because I changed the code on purpose.
Yeah.
Good.
Correct.
Importantly, it doesn't. So it won't actually fix it itself. So you'll have to. You can do this on your fork if you like. If you've got the reformatter black on your machine, then you can run it, commit, and then it should turn green.
When we are modifying the workflow, it triggers the workflow. Because
Yes, it will.
it's a push.
Because it's just a regular push, yeah. That's why it's actually, yeah, that's the most common way of doing work on a workflow is, yeah, you make a change to the workflow and then conveniently it runs itself. Yeah.
But also, when you're on a repository, you can hit just dot
Mic right next to your mic.
microphone.
So I find myself having to modify workflows sometimes from my phone or from devices that I don't own and I don't have Git set up. And you can just hit dot on your keyboard and it drops you into a Visual Studio Code running live that you can start editing and do modifications.
What?
Oh my goodness.
Did you know about that?
That's pretty cool. I didn't know that.
I had no idea about that. Thanks so much.
That's what you get when Microsoft buys Git.
I was going to say I wouldn't be able to do the file merging without moving to my shell, which was going to be a pain, but we do it here now. So sure.
You can even set up your plugins. You can give it a default environment that will install things like the Python plugins, and in 5 years we won't have laptops.
Just be dumb terminals connected to each other.
Yeah, finally we have gotten to the point where we only have dumb terminals.
That's really what you should do.
And then on the left-hand side, you have the Git symbol,
Yeah.
where you can then make the change and put it straight on here.
Oh, that wasn't the right click. Oh, so merge. Close.
Just hit dot. On your keyboard. When you hit a button, just hit
Ah. So the step I was failing to do was click, I understand my workflows, go ahead and enable them.
Yes.
Yeah, well done. Thank you.